I just want to do a quick intro about Franklin Street Works while we're waiting on Alex A or B or one or two. I don't want to do a hierarchy thing here, but so how many of you have not actually been to Franklin Street Works? Okay, great. Not great that you haven't been here, but great that I can tell you about it. My name is Terry Smith. I'm the creative director at Franklin Street Works. We're a small, only small in scale, not-for-profit art space, contemporary art space, and we do about 3 shows a year. Artists from all over the world. It's based on budget. Like we can do a video from France, but not a metal sculpture from France, right? So, but we've shown artists from all over. We show a lot of emerging artists. We also are very proud that we pay artists for commissioned works. We pay our presenters. We are free admission, so you can come in any time and look at art. If you come and visit and you like it, you can become a member and help support us. And yeah, I think that's, am I forgetting anything, Bonnie?
I just want to say it's really a hugely unique place in the region, and it is a place that you can go and see world-class museum quality art right here in Stanford. You don't have to go to the city, not that we don't want you to go to the new museum in the city, but it's really happening right here in Stanford. And Terry's work has won 2 awards from the Andy Warhol Foundation for Franklin Street Works, and in her previous career, another Warhol. So she's a 3-time Warhol winner, so it's worth coming to visit.
Yeah, and we have guest curators like Jeff Ostergren. So I curate some shows, but about 2/3 of the shows are guest curators because I only have my perspective and it's limited. So, okay, so that's good timing to introduce you. Okay, so I'm just reading Jeff's bio. I would like to say Jeff has been a friend of the space and involved in the space for at least 5 years, right? I think, yeah. Maybe even longer. He was in an exhibition I curated a while back, and that's how I met him. And in that process, realized he's an extremely smart artist, and now I know he's also an extremely smart curator. So Jeff has exhibited work in locations around the world, including Los Angeles, Vancouver, and the Czech Republic. Most recently, he had a solo exhibition entitled Death Masks at Art Space New Haven, as well as a solo commissioned installation, Science for a Better Life, a site-specific project at City Wide Open Studios in New Haven, in which he explored the chemical history of Bayer Pharmaceuticals. He also screened a work in Video Snack 6, Brooklyn in fall 2017, and which is currently screening as part of the Fikra Design Biennial and Sharjah, is that how you pronounce that? UAE. He is a recipient of a 2017 Artist Resource Trust grant from the Berkshire Taconic Foundation. He also has a curatorial practice, including our exhibition, False Flag, currently up at Franklin Street Works. In addition, he runs a project space called Tilia Projects in New Haven. He received his MFA from Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California in 2006, following upon receiving a BA in a double major of Anthropology and Gender Studies at Rice University in Houston, Texas in 1998. So Jeff will now take over. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you all so much for coming today. Making it out on this gloomy gray day. So I'm really honored to have 3 amazing panelists here today. So I think first what I'll do is just kind of give a brief introduction for each of them, and then I'll make a few opening remarks and then allow each of them to make a few opening remarks too, and then we'll have a little bit more of a kind of a discussion between the panelists. And if we have time at the end, we can do a little bit of audience Q&A. So if you have some questions, that would be great. If not, we're going to continue after here with a reception back at the space, and you're welcome to talk to any of us then too. So to my immediate left, Alexandra Bell is a multidisciplinary artist who investigates the complexities of narrative, information consumption, and perception. Utilizing various media, she deconstructs language and imagery to explore the tension between marginal experiences and dominant histories. Through investigative research, she considers the ways media frameworks construct memory and inform discursive practices around race, politics, and culture. Her work has been exhibited at MoMA PS1, We Buy Gold, Koenig and Clinton Gallery, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, Atlanta Contemporary, Pomona College Museum of Art, Spencer Museum of Art, and Osten Gallery at Bennington College. She is a recipient of the 2018 International Center of Photography Infinity Award in the Applied category. She is also a 2018 Soros Equality Fellow. Bell holds a BA in Interdisciplinary Studies in the Humanities from the University of Chicago and an MS in Journalism from Columbia University. She lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. To the next left, Alexandria Neeson, so also Alex. There'll be two Alexes here, so hopefully there won't be too much confusion. Alex Neeson is a staff writer at Columbia Journalism Review. She previously worked as a reporter at The Village Voice and covered education for The Teacher Project and Slate Magazine. A team she worked on won the 2016 Education Writers Association Award for news features. Her work has been published in Harper's Magazine, Bleacher Report, the Boston Globe Magazine, Time, and elsewhere. Before becoming a journalist, Neeson worked as a high school English teacher at Wahiawa, Hawaii. Hawaii. She's a graduate of St. John's University and the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. She lives in Uptown Manhattan, New York City. And then on my very far left, Jack C. Bradich is Associate Professor in the Journalism and Media Studies Department at Rutgers University. His research takes a critical approach to the intersection of popular culture and political culture. His work applies autonomous intersection of popular culture and political culture. His work, social theory to such topics as craft media, reality television, social movement media, and the cultural politics of secrecy. He is the author of Conspiracy Panics, Political Rationality and Popular Culture in 2008, and co-editor of Foucault, Cultural Studies and Governmentality, 2003. His most recent publications include Up All Night, Down for the Count, a compositionist approach to Nuit Debout, and International Journal of Communication. He is currently writing about cultural forms emerging from the failure of neoliberalism and the mobilization of communications warfare. He is a zine librarian at ABC No Rio in New York City. So please join me in welcoming all three of our panelists. And so, like I said, I'd like to start with a very kind of brief explanation of what we're going to do here, tied in a little bit to the exhibition, False Flag, the space between paranoia and reason, that I curated over at Franklin Streetworks. In putting together that exhibition, it sort of became very clear that there were lots of kind of, overlapping themes between the works, but the role of the media and distribution of information became, very clearly a sort of a dominant one. And just to look at a couple of works very briefly without getting into them too much. For instance, you'll see projected behind me here, a work like James Benning's Two Cabins here, in which he's constructed and then filmed reconstructions of cabins. One is by Thoreau and one is by Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and kind of looking at sort of connections and similarities and differences between these two individuals and the kind of radically different paths that they took and the radically different ways in which they've been sort of presented in history. Juliana Huxtable, in a lot of her work, and in this work, The War on Proof in particular, and in this series is really looking at the way in which language, words, and in this particular case, sort of classical texts, classical Greek or Roman texts, can be interpreted in extremely different ways. For instance, by the LGBTQ communities and by alt-right communities, the same texts have been used to sort of support their own means. And so, interested in kind of sort of complicated way in which language can have this doubling, and that's a really sort of dominant theme of work in the exhibition. Daniel Keller has a really brilliant video essay piece that I encourage you all to check out in the show. He talks about a lot of things, but one of them is this idea of the Streisand effect, sort of unintended consequences by drawing attention to something. There's a story in the news about an incident, an alt-right incident about a neo-Nazi group, and that draws attention to them, that brings them more followers, and to the sort of revealing of things. So the idea that the media has this kind of role that can have unintended consequences or perhaps intended consequences. And he also talks a lot about online communities, as does Theodore Darst in his work, The Tourist, This Machine Makes Fascists, a pun on the Woody Guthrie slogan. And in Darst's work, he's using a lot of online communities, sort of appropriating footage and language from prepper communities, gaming communities, and sort of talking about how sort of forms of new media kind of can sort of create and communities and create sort of problematic identities. And finally, Michael Green, who's an internet artist, did a take on the Pizzagate incident, which is sort of a kind of notorious incident, again, of this kind of fabrication of a scenario from the online world, from online forums and communities, and then it sort of blows up into this actual literal violent incident. So these are just, just a very quick sort of touching on some works in the show, and there's others that kind of do this. And so, none of them really deal directly with the news media, but it's sort of something, this idea of thinking about the media that is really interesting. And, this is something hopefully we'll get to in the discussion. Even when I just sort of started thinking about this, I looked up the origins of the word media, which, plural for medium. And as I sort of understood it, it goes back to the Latin for sort of an intermediate or middle condition. And I found this kind of a fascinating idea that the media is this kind of middle point between some kind of organization or individual that's producing it, and then some kind of a consumer that's receiving it. And that to me really tied in nicely to so many works in the show, which kind of have this process of steps between the production and the reception of the information. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll turn it over to Alex for a few opening comments from her.
Okay. Can you click that? Can I click that from here?
Yep, you can do it from here, or I can do it from here.
That's fine. I just wanted, my work isn't in the show, but it is to give you a sense of kind of what my work does. I investigate, I dig kind of through the archives to find instances of bias in news media. The project that I think has probably brought me the most attention is the counter narratives. I look at the New York Times for bias, and it's a public art project, and part of what I do is kind of reimagine articles and relay them out and present those in a public space. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So that people can kind of get a sense or learn different ways of kind of interpreting news media. I think the piece that's up here right now is a process note. Part of the way the series works is that there are two pieces. There's an original kind of New York Times article, usually with my kind of annotations and markings on it, and then there's a redo. And so there was a time where I was trying to figure out this process, and this was one of the many sheets that I kind of wrote out to try to get me to the next step. This is the work in kind of a public space. This one particularly interrogates New York Times reportage of the Michael Brown killing by Darren Wilson, where the Darren Wilson article was on one side and the Michael Brown article was on the other side. And so I was kind of asking the public to really kind of think of instances where objectivity is a problematic, right? And this is one of those, I think I read even in something about kind of a false fact, right? What is the way that we can kind of organize a set of facts in a way that doesn't feel exactly true? And so there's questions here really about false equivalency between kind of comparing a kid and a cop and arranging the stories in a way that treated them as equals. And so that was part of that. And this work was in Brooklyn. Each of those panels is 2 feet by 3 feet. And the idea is that the public would engage with it when they walk by. And this is another version of that, but this has an annotated sheet. So this is kind of a teenager with promise annotated. This is at the University of Kansas. That work is approximately 18 feet across and 8 feet per panel, 8 feet tall. This is the second work in this series, Olympic Threat. This work, there was, if you guys, I don't know if you can see the headlines from here, but it says something about swimmers and robbery, and there's not a photo of a swimmer there. There's a photo of Usain Bolt. So this is really kind of about representation and whiteness and how it operates in the paper. And so this is another work that was presented in Brooklyn. This one is about 14 feet across. Sarah? Oh. I didn't mean to exit us out. Okay. And then this one is from a current series that I'm working on called No Humans Involved after Sylvia Winter, that looks into the daily news reportage of the Central Park 5 jogger case. And I really kind of went through a series of about 40 pages worth of articles that were published in that paper from April 19th to May 1st. We start with the kind of, this is like the day after the crime. I'm looking for instances of language that's pathologizing and looking at the language that's applied to Black people and Black bodies. And so if you see here, there's Wolfpack's Prey. The rape occurred on the 19th. This is the front page on April 21st. And then we end with a kind of infamous Trump ad, which is called for the death penalty. And so my work interrogates those things. And so a lot of the things that I'll talk about will probably really ask you to kind of consider the ways in which the archive or the way the news media has operated for a long time, how we are seeing that probably more prominently now, or it's being talked about now, but it's not new.
Great, thank you. All right, Alex N.
I don't, unfortunately, don't have anything. Is this on? Okay. Oh, yeah, it's not on. Or we could just, yeah. We can share one.
This works too? Great. Cool, thank you. So as mentioned, I'm a staff writer at Columbia Journalism Review. We operate a website with stuff every day, and we also have a print magazine, and our role is it's sort of twofold. We operate like any other newsroom in that we report on media to include the business of media, and we write about all the other things that other journalists at other publications are sort of doing. The other side of that is that we operate sort of from a role of criticism, and so that includes writing about the things that journalists do wrong or do poorly. And in the last couple of years, that has been sort of interest in the media from the general public. It has increased a ton for the obvious reasons. And so I was at the Village Voice in 2016 and came to CJR in 2017. But my colleagues say that in that election cycle, really starting in 2015 and then on through November 2016, there was sort of this feverish renewal of interest in what journalists were doing, and not just the things that they were reporting on, but how they do their jobs. And as such, there was interest in CJR as kind of like a watchdog to be writing about and looking at what they're doing, and sometimes making judgments. And so that's what we do. It's been it's continues to be a wild ride every day, and I think I'll just pass it. I'm excited to chat.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, I'm Jack. I'm at the Rutgers University, State University of New Jersey, and I'm in the Journalism and Media Studies department. And maybe we can talk a little bit about why they almost have a separation, right? Journalism and media, like why those things are different. But I'd rather first talk about like my own work and how it's interesting for me. So that book, Conspiracy Panics, was published in 2008, and I thought I was finished with the topic, right? I'm just like, I spent all this time on it, I left it, and I moved on to other things, as mentioned, reality TV, social movements, secrecy, and I keep trying to leave it, and the world keeps bringing it back to me, including these feverish moments, right, where something like paranoia or conspiracy theories begin to circulate again. Not necessarily because there are more of them, but there's certainly more attention to them as problems. So I'll just mention two things briefly from the book that kind of I think are relevant for this particular set of topics for today in the exhibition. One is just, I was just thinking about, Alex, what you just said about journalism. So I have a chapter in there about journalism in the 1990s, professional journalism, and the rise of the internet, and the way that professional journalism began to re-authenticate itself over against things that were circulating on the internet and that were called conspiracy theories by professional journalism. It was a kind of a crisis of authority inside of professional journalism then, that then sought to rebrand itself inside of this chaotic space called the internet in the 1990s. But the other thing that I think is more conceptual is about the relationship between something called paranoia, conspiracy theories, and the fake. And one of the reasons I think the conspiracy theories are considered part of fake news is at the root of the word paranoia. I'm not the one who discovered this. In some ways, Richard Hofstadter, one of the early writers in the 60s about the paranoid style, uses that word to try to understand certain kinds of claims being made, political claims about how the world works. So the word paranoia, I mean, if you break it down, is an interesting one, right? It's para on the one side and nous, the mind, right? And the noid on the other. And the para is this similar kind of para that you find in like paramilitary or paralegal. It's not completely removed from the mind. It's actually close to it. It's beside it. It's similar to it. That's one of the things that Hofstadter finds so troubling about the paranoid style, is that it imitates rationality. It imitates reason. And it's hard to tell them apart, right? So I think one of the reasons, it's not just that it's like wrong, it's that they're almost trying to be a fake version of reason itself, a simulation of it, an imitator, a mimic, right? So the pretender is the thing that's really of concern for, I think, most of discourse that takes paranoia to be a problem. I tend not to find it that valuable of a term because it still draws on a kind of clinical, discourse that also marginalizes certain communities when it does so. So I'm interested in the politics of conspiracy-based narratives, but I think it's an interesting word, though, paranoia, because I think it really speaks to this idea of imitators being the threat, right? Again, the simulation. So that's the kind of conceptual thing I'd start with around paranoia and conspiracy and fakeness.
Great. Thank you all. Those are, I think, all some really great places to start. I think maybe sort of combining Alex and your first kind of thought, Jack, about the media. I mean, this sort of a opening question. I mean, we have this idea of the media, right? And it's a very broad term. And you sort of mentioned the journalism, the media, communications, and I think that might be a good place to start, just to sort of what are we talking about with the media, or what are each of you sort of see as the media, and is it a person, is it a group of people, is it a platform, is it personless? So I don't know if anyone would like to start with that, but that might be a good kind of opening.
I think this is a question that comes up a lot. I think not just at CJR, but in a lot of newsrooms. And I don't know that there is necessarily a consensus about what we mean when we say, when we use that term, the media. I think context matters a lot. It sort of depends on what we're talking about. It can refer to sort of this, like you said, faceless industry, like journalists or journalism, and the journalism as a verb, the practice of doing journalism. I think other times it can be much more specific than that. I think one thing, a conversation that I've had over and over and over again with friends and colleagues who work in journalism has been a sort of disgruntled, a discomfort with the use of the term on places like social media to refer very broadly, always in the realm of criticizing a thing, whatever the thing is, a story, the absence of a story, the way a story was done. And I think there's sometimes a frustration with a lack of specificity. So like, who exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about newspapers? Are we talking about cable news? Are we talking about monthly magazines? And so we all kind of fall under this umbrella of journalists and journalism and, literal media. But how we operate, there are some differences across that space. And so I think it's not always clear sort of what we're talking about. I think often of, media studies programs at universities, for example, and how the use of the word media in that context means something different than just a journalist working at a news publication, something much broader than just a journalist working at a news publication. So I think there's often a lack of specificity there, and I'm not always sure what we mean when we say that.
That's funny. I was a media studies major for 2 seconds. And I wasn't trying to be in journalism. I was probably more film, but it was, for me, I think anything kind of dealing with media, radio, broadcast news, print media, that's generally what I mean when I say media. I try not to say the media because my work focuses on very specific critiques of specific elements of media, but there are moments when I say newspapers and I'm kind of blaming everybody for something. So I would kind of piggyback Alex N's definition, but then also say when I use the term the media, I'm usually pairing it with mainstream. And so in that sense, I'm talking about the New York Times, or I'm talking about CNN or the Washington Post, things that I feel like are most of us have access to or may see or hear, whether it be an NPR. I'm less likely, if I'm saying mainstream media, to be talking about a local paper or a school paper. So that's, but I agree with everything she said.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would think that it's one of those words that people always think they have some concrete thing in mind, but it's almost like asking, like, what is philosophy, or just like what is history, right? There are a lot of nuances that need to come into play. I think of it as it can combine both the kind of professional news organizations, professional journalism, but it also speaks to things like popular culture as well, a different way of thinking about film, TV, radio, music, fashion. And I think what brings them together, to me, are like three things. One is the technological side, the delivery system for the production of meaning, and that's more like the classic media of like print, radio, TV, right? The kind of system, now social, right? The systems that produce and generate and circulate meaning. The second one would be institutional. So you look at the actual organizations and their role in a society. So that would be, professional journalism is not just, a series of platforms. It's also a set of protocols about what it means to be a journalist. One could also say something similar about how Hollywood works, right? To think about an industry as part of that institutional. And the third one is more of like the personal, which is a relationship between makers and but also producers and audiences, basically. So you could find all those things both in professional journalism, but also in something like, Hollywood production as well. So I think media can combine those that way.
But it seems like, sort of what all these answers have in common is that there's this kind of, that there is something being produced and delivered, right? There's something that there is a producer and a kind of consumer. Sort of going back, Alex B, to your sort of opening comment, this is something I really would love to get into, is sort of a little bit of the history around this, how this is, this isn't what we sort of talk about with fake news or false facts. This isn't something that's new, or this isn't something that is recent, but it's something that without knowing very much about it, seems to be like part of the structure of media from its beginnings. I don't know if that's something you would agree with, or if you have thoughts on that.
I would totally argue that. When I do a talk, I normally go through a series of slides that go back until the 1800s, and in that context, blacks appear in the newspaper as slaves for sale. They're not part of any of the stories that are circulating. In fact, until the 40s, many papers had actual editors to actually remove images of black people. That's fake news to me, right? And so when we start talking about kind of the Pizzagate, I'm like, we've been in fake news, right? And so if we imagine that the newspapers that existed operated without the inclusion of the majority of the population, right? Because the slave population was outnumbered the white population. That's fake news. And that's kind of like mainstream news at the time. The classifieds were where you could sell slaves and find them and buy them. There wasn't an article that was necessarily focused on that. If recently there have been, you talked about this, right? The apology for kind of the representation of lynchings in papers, right? And papers referred to them as like backyard barbecues. They were celebratory. I don't necessarily think that's fake. They were celebratory occasions, but I think the institution of journalism has buttressed a number of inequalities, and I think that that in part was propagated through fake news, through the kind of creation of a particular narrative that serviced one population and not the others. That's sort of what I'm saying, that it's sort of built into the structure of media itself. Absolutely. Right? Mm-hmm.
It sort of, to your point, speaks to what is like a relatively modern idea and debate about journalistic objectivity and sort of what we mean. So when you hear the term fake news, which existed, I believe, as a vocabulary word before the 2016 election cycle, but I think it's often attributed as becoming sort of hyper-popularized in that year. But when we talk about like what is fake news, I mean, it depends so much on who you ask, and it relies on some objective reality that is agreed upon. And like Alex was saying, if you really interrogate the institution of journalism, and it's really not difficult to do so, it just requires going into any archive and looking at old newspaper articles, the objective reality of the reporters who worked at those newspapers was, did not reflect what was actually happening. And so it's interesting to consider that today, to consider sort of that legacy and that history of reporting being done where the objective reality was displayed in a newspaper that was in many ways the total opposite and just an outright lie to what was actually happening. And it's interesting to consider our conversations about fake news and to consider debates that we have constantly about objectivity and what it means and whether it's possible. I think that's a piece of that conversation that I don't hear often. I don't often hear us sort of talking about the legacy of journalism and like actually thinking about when does that term begin to mean something for journalism, objectivity, and considering fake news in that sort of environment.
Yeah, exactly. To build off of that, exactly. I mean, it's like the history of objectivity as the value for professional journalism begins to, complicate all these presentist things. I agree, totally. I mean, it's just like like when do facts emerge as something that matter? For whom do they matter, and how are they constructed, right? And what kind of institutions then claim ownership or authority over defining those facts? When go back to etymology, the root of the word fact is also the same thing we have in manufacturing or factory. It's about making. So the fact, we've lost the idea of the making part of the fact. And now we just act as though it's just a settled matter that requires no idea about making and manufacturing. So again, yeah, to go back to the points of both of you have made about just like the history of the ways that facts both matter and then also don't, and it becomes a question of authority rather than just about truth on its own. Now, to me, it's like, why now though? Why is the fact and the fake such an important object for people to be concerned about? And partially, I would say it's a crisis in those institutions that used to be able to claim legitimacy over them. Now we're seeing some skepticism about those very institutions, be they certain kinds of professional journalistic practices or investigative bodies by the U.S. government, for instance. So the kind of crisis of legitimacy and crisis of authority and trust is built into it. We're already taking, so we got a hand up, right?
Probably not yet. We're going to hold the questions for a little bit, I think. So I think that's a really interesting. It's very interesting to try to tie it into the present, right, and sort of to feel what's happening. I mean, I think it's also this idea of fake news and false facts. It also seems like it has. It's in a way it's sort of being used by both sides, right? It's sort of being used as a kind of, or if there's sides, if you want to put it, but it's being used by people to kind of call out the media as saying there's a problem, but then it's also being kind of willfully manufactured at certain points, right? And so, I mean, that's something else that I've sort of just in thinking about this, I've had a hard time kind of grappling with, and I would love to get all of your take on is just sort of what is the media's role in this? I mean, because in some cases they are revealing something, and in some cases they're producing something, whether it is sort of willfully or whether it is with a kind of a bias that's latent and they, only upon revealing that they sort of regard. But this kind of object that is being manufactured, and sort of how the media's role in it in terms of playing both sides, if that makes sense. I don't know if Jack, if you want to start and work our way back. Yeah,
I mean, it brings up this question of intentionality, certainly about like whereas what we're also discussing, I think, here in the panel is the kind of unconscious processes that form ideology, right? It's like one doesn't have to be willfully manufacturing something to be manufacturing something, but doing it based on a series of hidden assumptions and biases. So I'm trying to think who coined, I don't know if it was Bell Hooks, the word willful neglect, right? So the ability to be willful in your ignorance, right? Or willful ignorance, right? So how do we think about that too in a moment of what we manufacture? What are we not attending to, in terms of power when we're manufacturing a fact? So that's one of my ways of thinking about it.
I mean, I'm always curious about what the media, and I'll say it, gives attention to, right? And so it's interesting to have this kind of Wolfpack's prey up, during the week of so Trisha Meili was jogging, she was attacked, raped brutally, she lost like 80% of her blood, national news, kids were rounded up within that evening. She was probably one of maybe 27 women sexually assaulted in New York that week. She had like 40 pages of coverage. 24 of those women were Black and Latina, and there was a serial rapist raping Latina and young Hispanic girls, 15 and 16 years old. There were 3 rapes within the span of the time that I was researching and reading. I found a paragraph and maybe a page on page 25, like 3 rapes in. This woman had 40 pages worth of coverage. I really can honestly say I think it was because she was a white woman. And I think that media so it doesn't mean that her rape did not happen, but there's been a narrative constructed around that the media is giving you a sense of who matters when that type of thing occurs. And so I'm really curious about that. Another thing that's really important about archival news and looking back at it in the 40s, there was a study published by Robert B. Eliezer, I think, A Churchman Sees Peril in Negro Headlines, where he did a comparison of newspaper coverage of crimes and the tendency for newspapers to name race in the headline in the 40s. And 1 month, there were 36 crimes or court appearances, because I think those all appeared in the paper, by Blacks, and the word Negro was in the headline 34 out of 36 times. And another month, that same month actually, out of 131 crimes and court cases involving white people, race was mentioned in the headline 0. So these are factual things, but these frameworks have presented a different type of view of criminality, right? And so I think that it's, media is definitely complicit. We can't say that it's kind of not. I don't think that there's a willful indifference. I think there are a set of questions that aren't being asked. And I think they could easily be asked, right? You could ask yourself, like, why are there so many men in the paper and not a lot of photos of women? There's a way to get around these things. It's not like rocket science to me, right? And so I'm really curious about that. And I think what's happening now, it's unfortunate that the person in office is maybe the catalyst for some of this thinking. And he's also a key component of this kind of, Central Park 5. But this is a long tradition before this man of this kind of work being produced. And I think frameworks are just as important, right? So we get caught up a lot of times on what's true. Okay, I mean, I don't think the Times is just publishing blatant lies, but I think there are ways that, let's think about October. Let's think about like 3 or 4 weeks before the midterms, right? And Trump had decided that this caravan thing was really going to be what he kind of used to kind of frighten people. And if you're listening and you hear him and he's saying you kind of don't know where the caravan is, you think the caravan could really be right outside of like the border of California for all he cares. I found it troubling that I kept seeing these photos of like all of these people traveling together with these tiny words, like about how many thousands of miles away they were. Like in passing, this can add to this kind of cacophony that's not necessarily true. Like there are ways to kind of try to, I think that journalism has to be kind of defensive in a way. I don't know. There's something that's not happening that can happen. And I think they're being exposed now by someone that really a lot of people maybe don't respect, but he knows how to operate and kind of manipulate the media.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, I sort of, I'm glad we haven't really had to bring him up until now in the talk. But,
Sorry.
No. I think it's important. We do have to talk about him, right? And sort of what's happening now, because that's, I mean, we've already sort of mentioned that there's this kind of something in the air, right? That where there's this kind of all this attention to the media, there's talk of paranoia and fake news and false facts, and that's, you know, that is around. It's happening because of Trump, or it's happening at the same time, right? Concurrently. So. So what I mean, it'd be interesting to hear everyone sort of, you know, what else is happening now. How is there's obvious ways in which he's influencing the media, using the media, but it'd be interesting to kind of bring him into the discussion, at least briefly, before we move on, and just sort of acknowledge what he's, you know, what he's doing now.
I've said my piece.
Yeah, you said your piece.
I won't say anymore.
Alex, Zach?
I think that part of what continues to happen, or what is happening, is a sort of, it's a sort of self-examination that's happening in public view and that is constantly changing. When terms, you know, we've now, the term fake news is here, and so we contend with that, and for journalists for political journalists, people whose job it is to report on the White House and on the president, I think that there's a sort of crisis of how to do that, and that the industry has tried a lot of different things, and then has to respond to criticisms of the things that they have tried. And so something that kind of immediately comes to mind, Poynter just recently did a study, or maybe somebody else might have done the study, and then Poynter wrote about this, but it was a look at the use of the word lie in describing things that the president says. And so, you know, a journalist shows up, and the job of that journalist is to report on something that is happening. And so whether it is a policy, whether it is reporting on a caravan and where they're at, and perhaps President Trump says something, and so the journalist is now like, okay, I have to report on this thing that he said, and the thing that he said is not true, and how do I communicate that the thing that he said isn't true in my story, or in my headline, or increasingly in the tweet that describes the story that many people don't actually click on. And these are, I mean, these are decisions that mean a huge amount now, and so basically this study was looking at the use of the word lie, and it's not common that reporters will describe something that he said as a lie, and this is a thing that there are like these internal fights about. If you log on to Twitter for 30 seconds, you can see people commenting on what to do and what not to do about describing a thing as a lie versus something that isn't true. I've seen things described as without evidence, like in the Times and in the Washington Post. And so, you know, X thing, you know, Trump says X thing without evidence. And there's this sort of avoidance of the word lie, because, I mean, some people will say that, you know, can you prove a lie? Is a lie only a lie because the person like willfully didn't tell the truth? And, you know, you can't journalistically prove intent most of the time, and so perhaps that's a reason why we don't see that. But I think, anyways, like this sort of grappling is happening kind of in full public view, which is a thing that I think is difficult. And so, yeah, this is kind of all part of this ecosystem, this environment where everyone is kind of trying to figure out how do we do these things, and what is the proper way to respond to criticisms, because sometimes the criticisms are very valid, and I think that that's a muscle that's still being sort of developed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really difficult situation. My framework tends to be about warfare, and I think what this president has done, and he's explicit about it, he's declared war on the press. And so in so doing, he has weaponized fake news, the term fake news. It's existed as a term of criticism, as a term of analysis, but now it's a weapon. And as the old adage goes, right, the first casualty of war is truth. Now, I think even the first casualty of war, I just made this up, is the false. Meaning, like, you can't even say, like, oh, this is wrong, this is false. It doesn't matter in the same way, right? Because in a different kind of war, calling someone inaccurate, means very little when someone is actually just saying, I don't even care about your fact checking. You aren't even real news. And to be able to undermine the authority of an institution by just calling it fake is something that goes beyond the ability that truth and falsity can capture. So I think we're in a different kind of a setting, because I think that even that older kind of, understood pact between the professional press and the presidency has been broken. And I think that's quite new in a way, right? That the degree to which, a presidential figure will just eliminate people from the press pool. I mean, that's just not that it's unheard of, but the degree to which that can happen now is I would say unprecedented. But maybe historians know better. But let's think about how that truth or falsity has little to do to respond to that, and even when they then doctor a video around it, right? So anyway, so to me it's about war, and so how then do we deal with a war that involves a weapon called fake news?
And I think it's also interesting to, the sort of broad dismissal of, like you said, of a whole institution and of a set of norms within that institution that are being so publicly challenged and with such success now. It sort of brings, it sort of neuters the press in a way. So, a story goes out and there's reporting that's there and it's called fake. And so what happens next? Sort of the reaction, which is to show your work. And so it calls to mind this question of, like, does the truth even matter anymore, and what is the truth, and what is a fact? And we don't agree about what a fact is, because in some respects it doesn't matter that you lay out documents that say this thing that this person said is not true. This isn't what happened. And you can sort of lay that out, and it doesn't matter. And this doesn't just exist when we're talking about reporting on the president. This is, you see examples of this in a lot of different places. I read a story on Friday in the New York Times by Erica Green and Katie Bennett, a story about a school in this horrifying story about a school in Louisiana, and where these two founders of a school, and there's a lot of lying and abuse, and you should all read it. But in the story, there's a family who'd pressed charges against one of the owners of this school for assault against a child, and the guy denied it, and they said, well, here's like the police report, or here's the piece of paper that says this is the thing that happened, and it was kind of just like, well, that's not what happened. And you see that, and I can think of like a dozen stories where that's sort of true, where you report on a thing and you interview the person and give them their piece to speak, and they say it didn't happen, and then you've got some other sort of piece of some document, a court record perhaps, that at some point was considered a thing that you can't argue against, perhaps, and now suddenly it's up for debate. And sort of what that means for the efforts of journalism and of journalists, I think, is a really complicated and seems new or newish.
And I think, we've all sort of touched on this a little bit, but I think turning to like the technological and the role that plays too. I was struck, Alex B., when you were talking about sort of the visuals of placement, and it's comparing the size of an image with the text beneath it, and just kind of the literal kind of visual language and the language of text itself. It also seems not unconnected that there's this kind of digital realm that we're in now, and it would be interesting to hear each of your thoughts on sort of how that is kind of tying into things as well. Both it's connected to old media, but also to
Yeah.
platforms.
I have mixed feelings about the internet. And a lot of my work deals with print media in part because I imagine, or I believe, I'm convinced that the audience that pays $6 for a Times on Sunday looks very different from a reader online, right? And so I think that, there's, you can see the differences. Some of it is like search engine optimization and all these other things, but I also think the paper's catering to a particular population in print media. So that's part of why I focus on that. Online, I don't know if you guys are like this as CJR, but a lot of online news develops over time. So you can see something that's posted at 3 and it's updated at 4 and it's updated at 5 and it's updated at 7. And so there's a lot of change happening. And so I'm really interested in what the paper committed to. And so the print to me is like, what did you say? That's it right there. We're going to go with that. And so I think sometimes the hierarchies aren't as clear online. And because everything's in color, there are a lot of different things about online media to me that are weirdly, that make things seem weirdly equal or even. And I think that can suss out a bias a bit more in the paper. What's above the fold, what's below the fold, what's in color, what didn't get color, what's in the interior versus what's not. I also think it's fast. It's so fast, right? And there's so much information. And so I think the internet works in a sense that, I can read an article and then maybe I can go and look up other things to help me if I'm interested in that, right? I don't know how much people are interested in truth now, right? So that's another question. And I think that's some of what the other Alex was saying in terms of this kind of broader dismissal effects, right? And so the internet, it's interesting. There's an article that I have this, because I get asked this question a lot. Why don't you work with internet? There's an article about the pipeline protests in North Dakota. And the online version says something about neighbors grow tired of protesters, And the print version was, Indian pipeline protests make for frustrated, fearful whites. That was the print version. And I was like, okay. So there was just a different, I felt like the title was pointing people to something else. That is what the article ultimately was about, but I think that titles are really important for creating frameworks. But I think the internet and I think then that becomes where you can kind of think about the vastness of the term media, right? Because then we can talk about Instagram, we can talk about Facebook, which has its own kind of fake news problems happening, and how much information people can get access to, the tendency to maybe read things in passing without clicking through and reading. Like those are a lot of things that happen, I think, more so online than they do if you're kind of operating in kind of the paper world. I also was a print media major, so I'm biased. But I don't know if, I think and I'm not going to bring him up again, but as somebody who's critical of kind of newspapers and print media, I think there are ways to kind of train ourselves up to maybe look and think about these things in more fair, critical ways, so that there's not just this blanket dismissal of like, you don't exist, what you're writing is wrong. But I can say, okay, this is information that's really important. There are a set of questions as a reader that maybe I should be asking myself that I don't typically ask myself. And if there's a way, whether via like public art or even kind of online groups, to build a community of people who are just as invested in kind of truth seeking. And so I think the internet, and I feel like I'm way off the question you asked, if the internet can kind of provide the environment for that. But I'm also kind of skeptical about it for various reasons. But I use it. I'm always online.
I mean, just in terms of like the daily practice of journalism, the internet is sort of a double-edged sword in that it makes, it has opened up so many tools, not just for the reader, the person who's looking for whatever news about whatever it is that they want to read about, but also for the practitioner, for the journalist, sort of has broadened a set of tools that help us do our jobs. It also makes our jobs like infinitely more difficult, because you run into, particularly with like social media, because you run into problems where, so many of them, everything from the way that news is shared on social media, and it is constantly a problem for every journalist I know, whether they work at the smallest local newspaper or at a TV station, at a national place, the sort of problem of a story that gets shared but doesn't get read, and about then how headlines become so much more important in communicating what people will take away from the thing that they don't read, and then how they comment on it and how they share it, and how that sort of just spreads like wildfire. And so a lot of times you'll see something shared and you can sort of watch the commentary about the thing that's being shared on various social networks, and it is so detached from what the story actually says, if you read it, that it becomes really difficult to engage with people, because they have seen a headline, or they have seen a deck that shows up in a tweet, or they have seen what their friend said about the thing that about the link that they shared. And then it becomes difficult to engage with them sometimes once they've decided what the thing says, even if that isn't what the thing says. So there's sort of that complication. And then there are things that kind of get into looking at the role of like the social media networks and the companies themselves, and on places like Facebook, where people who are making actual fake news, newspapers that are not actually news organizations, and there are pages and they look like news organizations, and the URLs look like news organizations that you might recognize and trust, and then there are stories that are just completely false, completely full of, lacking any truth at all, and sort of what the consequences of that are. And that's where you see things like conspiracy theories and just sort of information that people begin to think is true, that's just not rooted in any fact at all. And it spreads, it's so powerful when it spreads on social networks in that way. So it's the problems are multifaceted.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that, it's a great part about the shared but not read, right? So the corporate platforms, the corporations that own social media platforms, derive profit not from the content of anything necessarily, right? But it's the shareability of it, its circulation. So for at least a decade, there was just this like investment in pure circulation, in pure spreading. That's the thing that they could then sort of track and extract value out of that. So now we're at a crisis where it's like that content indifference and indifference to what was in there is now becoming a problem, right? So it's endemic to the certain kinds of corporate ownership of platforms themselves, like where they were deriving profit. That was the around that. So and now we're facing it. Now they're doing mea culpas and trying to figure out new algorithms to filter stuff. But it was again, it was at the core of the way that they generated their own profit. The other side to this, and maybe if we can move almost like between like journalism and the information-based side and then the art side, which is popular culture, right? The sort of ways that entertainment produces a kind of set of emotions and affects around conspiracies. I mean, from genres. I mean, in the 90s, I forget who coined the term paranoir, right? There's a whole series of movies from the 1990s that are dealing specifically with conspiracies. We still have them. We have a whole kind of atmosphere in security-based post 9/11 TV shows, which is about a certain kind of, security concern about detecting enemies all the time, right? That's kind of a version of paranoia, right? So the ways that, popular culture has invested a certain set of pleasures into the idea of the conspiracy, I think, is also a mediating factor when it comes to social media and the circulation and the sharing of this that rarely gets talked about. It's not, we're not just cognitive beings, filtering information around truth. We're also beings that have certain kinds of affective investments in certain narratives about how the world works.
It's also something you said reminded me of this. We've talked about sort of the influence of kind of the phenomena of fake news and from the White House and sort of how the press and media is discussed and how that influences the movements of the media. And these companies, places like Facebook and Twitter, sort of exercise an immense amount of influence on the media, sort of on the business side. There's this sort of some kind of cynical way we talk about a thing that happened at many news outlets, the pivot to video. Basically, Facebook said, "Oh, video is the thing, and we're going to sort of help news outlets." Reach the audience, the immense audience that exists on Facebook, and they want to watch videos. They don't want to read anything. And so news outlets hired video teams like wildfire, hired them all, and they were going to do video. And then suddenly video was like not the thing, and it turns out nobody wanted to watch video. And so Facebook said, "We're done with that," and everyone got fired. And so this is like the pivot to video. And it was like Facebook decided the thing, and the news organization said okay, and they just did it, almost without thought. And we're still seeing sort of the consequences of that, and in that, a lot of digital outlets. It isn't even just like newspapers that have been for 20 years now trying to rework the business model to exist in a way, on the internet. It's digital only outlets also that are trying to figure this out and sort of at the mercy of these social networks, because that's where all the people are. And so there was just Mike, a digital only, a youngish digital-only news outlet, was just purchased by Brian Goldberg, who owns Bustle, who also recently bought Gothamist, and then everybody was fired. They had a whole pivot to video, sort of issue themselves. And so I think that kind of, when we talk about who's sort of exerting power over the movements and behaviors of the media or of journalism, it isn't just people in politics. It isn't just the people and institutions that we cover. It's also looking at sort of the platforms that we disseminate our news and reporting on.
It's not to me, there's not when I was in J school, a big question that our professors used to kind of ask us is, who's telling the story? Like, whose story is it? Mm-hmm. And I think he wanted us to understand that while we were getting information from the public, we also had a power to make people look at something else, like that we could do that. And what I see that I feel like is somewhat detrimental, not that I believe that, newspapers should be so top down, but that there's such a drive to feed whatever the fad is. Mm-hmm. They just kind of get dragged along, right? So, in the Central Park Five is really interesting because it's like, well, you guys, I mean, they were ultimately found not guilty, but you thought you caught them. So please explain to me the other 40 pages worth of reporting after you caught them, right? There was one article that was like, jogger blinks twice. Like, why is this an article, right? There's this kind of feeding into this frenzy. They're responding to kind of what people are kind of asking for. And so I think if there's anything that I've seen be most damaging is that I think you can witness that, like that kind of desperation and that being pulled. It's like when the Wall Street Journal did the Kavanaugh op-ed. There are these moments where it's like you're really undercutting yourself in service of this kind of popularity. Where papers kind of get taken for this ride. I think you had something in the questions that we previously talked about that was like kind of about ad space and being able to kind of rent out segments of paper to put things in that may not be true. So there are all these other things that I think are happening in addition to the internet that I think undercut the legitimacy of news media.
Yeah, and I think maybe we sort of have time for one kind of more point, and I think sort of based off on all this, I guess I'd maybe like to sort of put you all on the spot and say like how how do we sort of, what's the next step to kind of like try to address this, right? It's clear from everyone here that there's problems out there in terms of how the media is functioning and how people are receiving it, and so what is some possible, I mean, you sort of talked a little bit about this, Alex, and B, in terms of, the potential for sort of a better readers and a community to kind of counteract what's being put out there. But it's a big question, but just sort of in sort of simple terms, is there a way that, is there an obligation that the media has to kind of fix this in a way? Maybe they wouldn't, but is there a way that they could? Is there a way that the rest of us as readers, as consumers can be better consumers?
I mean,
That's the question of the
yeah,
century.
this is a question. This is a question I'm always like, we're doomed, though.
And maybe that's the answer. I don't know.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think part of it is that some of the issues that we're struggling with are they're in the DNA of this kind of institution and this system, right? And so we can find a bunch of Band-Aids, which is why I kind of focus, I think, on the reader side, right? I'm really kind of interested in if there are different sets of, if news media is really responding to what they see as a type of demand from the population, is there any way that from that end we can kind of shift the way we read news, the types of things that we demand from news, and if that would have an impact? I don't know. I did a panel with ICP in London a few weeks ago, and there was a photo editor from The Guardian who was also really concerned, and it was interesting because she was responding to the work of another artist that kind of said, had issues with how photos were laid out in the paper. And I think this all part of it was started. There was a photo of a spade, and then there was like a black lady next to it. And she was saying that was offensive. She didn't understand that. But she started this whole process at The Guardian where when they're done, I think with the paper, they'll go through and they'll count men and women. Like they felt like gender was something they could kind of maybe tackle first, or that it was easier to kind of tackle and just simply by counting, and trying to get it behind why there weren't more images of women, and not replace those with necessarily like articles about baking, but maybe other things to, to try to do something a little bit more equal. So I think there are solutions to some things at every corner, right? There's something that editors can do differently, and I'm not one to run around screaming diversity, because in fact, a number of the people who wrote the articles that I critique are actually minorities themselves. But I think that it's probably more along the lines of the readership. I think that's where I would focus my attention. I would kind of say, if you're a reader and you're casually reading the paper and there's something that's getting a lot of attention, ask yourself why. Ask yourself what's not being talked about. Ask yourself why this person. I don't think it's tacky to kind of ask yourself why maybe one shooting might be covered different than another, right? So, I had a piece where I questioned the Times' use of this kind of really now famous Charlottesville photo where they show the driver kind of running over this group of people. And part of that questioning came from, one, understanding the severity of that, but also saying, well, if this was a Black Lives Matter protest that had turned out like this footage would be different. And so I think we can kind of really start to think about those things and compare. I would say readers should do that, and I think that's a tiny step. I don't know about the newspapers. I'm more inclined to go with the "we're doomed" answer.
I mean, I don't know that there's one answer to how to do this, and it's definitely something that journalists are trying to figure out. I do think that, like you said, Alex, that sort of one part of this is a set of skills being taught to and encouraged in readers and consumers. In the last couple of years, I've seen this sort of boom might be a dramatic word, but an increase in media literacy programs at the K-12 level, and an interest from like teachers and librarians and nonprofit groups and schools and school districts themselves saying like, we need to, this is a set of skills that we need to be teaching kids, and you start to see it happening younger and younger and younger. So I think part of that, sort of teaching people to ask those questions is part of it. And then I think in newsrooms, what we've seen is kind of an attempt to make it much clearer how we do our jobs. And so if you read news online, I don't know that I see this in print, like in newspapers or magazines, but definitely in online stories in various news outlets, and particularly with long investigative stories, you start to see sometimes like editor's notes or these sort of whatever the digital equivalent of a sidebar is, where it says how we reported this story. And it's an offering of more information to the reader about here's what we found and here's how we found it. These are the type of documents that we looked at. Here's how many of them there are. Here's a database in some instances where you can look at them yourself, and sort of an explanation. I think that is one thing that folks have tried to do. And then it's about, I think, response to criticism and a response to readers when they have something to say about a story that was written and how it was written, and when they have questions about why we did the thing that we did. And I've seen this go a number of different ways. There's a story that comes to mind. I wrote a short piece, I think it was over the summer, it might have been in August. There was a piece in the Washington Post about a chicken plant in Pennsylvania, and it sort of exist in the genre of stories inspired by the realization that, rural white voters were ignored during the election cycle and not taken seriously. And so there's been this sort of reaction, and some might say an overreaction in reporting on those voters. Those communities. And anyways, there's a story, and it's about a chicken plant. And it's about these two young white workers in this rural, low-income area working in a chicken plant where they are one of very, very few other white people employed there. The plant is majority Latino, and there was a lot of criticism of the way that story was reported, in that folks felt like that it was a couple, and that were sort of the main characters in this story, and that they were allowed to sort of espouse racism without challenge, in the name of like, this is just what they said and this is how they feel. And so there was a response to that from a number of folks, including NAHJ, the National Association for Hispanic Journalists. And so I called them and talked to them about what the particulars, what their issues were in the story. I spoke to other journalists, other Latino journalists, about what they thought about it. And then I called the Washington Post, and they said very little. And ultimately, basically what it amounted to is they said, we are sticking to our story, we stand by our story and how it was reported, is kind of what they said. And so you don't always see the sort of response that you would like to see. The other side of that is we've seen kind of in the last year and a half, especially, these sort of like a redemption tour. We've talked about this from newspapers, sort of reckoning with with sort of the sins of the past. The Montgomery Advertiser did. There's a major lynching memorial that opened in Montgomery, and the Montgomery Advertiser ran a front page in covering the opening of this memorial. Ran a front page editorial, the title of which I believe was "Our Shame," and it was this very frank article that's written by the editors of that paper that said, when we reported on lynchings, and our reporting was an aid to white supremacy, really is what they said. And they said, we celebrated this, we questioned nothing, and we messed up big time. And they ran images of people who had been lynched in that area, and sort of that was kind of the way that they were going to deal with that newspaper and journalism at large participation in white supremacy on sort of the eve of the opening of this museum and memorial. And you've seen that at National Geographic. And you've seen it at the New York Times, where they did a big project running obituaries of women, prominent women, people that I was... Ida B. Wells, Sylvia Plath, women whose deaths just were not reported in the newspaper. And they're women that you say now, and it's like, well, how could this person have been ignored? And so they ran these obituaries of these women. There's a book, I went to a book talk the other day for a book that was published by a photo editor and a reporter at the Times called Unseen. And they are just these beautiful, gorgeous images of Black people famous and regular on the street folks that just existed in the New York Times archives, and people who had never appeared in the New York Times. And this was everything from just folks in Harlem on the street, kids playing, and also like Richard Wright was never, was never photographed. Well, his photograph never ran in the Times. And so there's this sort of idea of reckoning with those things. And I think what we've got to get to is sort of doing that for all of the stuff that has happened that we haven't dealt with in the past, but also learning how to do that in real time.
Wow, that's really powerful. I mean, it makes me think about the ways that truth and reconciliation things have taken certain formal developments in other places, but we might be witnessing some kind of not very formalized one, but it's distributed, and people are trying to think about this. It also reminds me of my colleague at Rutgers, Chenjerai Kumanyika, is one of the co-producers of a podcast called Uncivil, and it's about revisiting the Civil War and the histories and untold stories and forgotten stories there. So the way I think about where we are right now is, I mean, it's oddly optimistic, but most people won't like to hear this. I think we're in a series of wars right now. So I think about war as a framework. I think we're seeing a kind of resurrecting of certain U.S. Civil War moments, obviously with the rise of certain kinds of Confederacy-based ideologies and actions, Charlottesville. I think we're in a strange kind of revisiting of the Cold War with this so much anti-Russia stuff. I think we're seeing, a war on women. We are seeing cyber war, all forms of war are suddenly appearing in the same moment right now for me. So to me, it's thinking through what it means to take that seriously about what happens in a democracy when real war has arrived. This is also going to be related to the false flags. So because false flags, the idea, and maybe Jeff, you can talk about this too, is comes out of maritime law, but also kind of warfare on the seas. But the other thing that I think about is this moment where we can rethink what the fake is, instead of always having a long history of Western thought, really, that has marginalized and excluded the fake and the simulation as a threat to something, to think about other ways to think about fakeness, which is about performance, which is about making, which is about fabulation, and in all those words, fabrication, fabulation, and what that might mean to the kind of world we want to make, right? So rather than think about it as about a series of information-based decisions in the world, but what is the world that you want to fabulate in a time of war, and how do we find people to do that with? So, which also goes back to the idea of the false flag, right? It's a fake flag. It's a disguise, right? You're disguising yourself as someone else in the history of the term false flag. Now it's been appropriated by the right. And circulated. I just read something in CJR about the history of false flags. It just came out at the end of October. Fascinating stuff. So anyway, but the point is that to think about what it means to make a world when certain versions of that world might be crumbling in the attachments that people have had to certain kinds of notions of the public or democracy. And so, how do we want to think about the aftermath of that?
Wow. Well, thank you all so much. That was a really sort of, I think, powerful way to end from all three of you. Unfortunately, we have a hard deadline to be out of here at 5:30. The library has kept us open an extra half hour for us. So we won't be able to take any questions now, but I would really encourage everyone here to come back to Franklin Street Works, which is just 2 blocks away. And you're welcome to then talk to any and all of us with any questions. But thank you so much to our panelists and their brilliant thoughts. It was really great.
Thank you to the library also for collaborating with us and staying open late. So yeah, just go out the front door of the library, turn right, and then turn right on Franklin Street, kind of near the Target, and we're on the right if you haven't been there. So we'll see. And we have snacks, and we can keep talking. Bye.
I almost had to look it back up to see if it was